Now that you've begun your research journey, Module 3 is going to be particularly important to you because in this module we're going to consider the different ways in which education research has been approached over the past several decades and the philosophical and theoretical undercurrents that have supported or challenged changing approaches to educational research. I want to say up front, however, that many of the concepts in the readings and videos, and the one video rather, and the language around them in this module are difficult, and especially when first encountered. And there is a lot packed into this module, so I know you're up for it, but if you have questions along the way, please do feel free to ask them. For some of the more complex terms, you can use reputable online sources like the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, to help with some of the language and concepts. But, questions are always welcome too. Because of the breadth of the content in this module, this video is longer than usual, and I apologize for that, but I hope it will be helpful in kind of laying the groundwork and sorting through some of the concepts and understanding them so that as you move forward through the readings, those meanings will be in the back of your mind. Before we move on, I would like to talk a bit about the assignments. I'm not going to talk very long about this, but in Module 3, the discussion forum for which you'll follow the usual process, you'll just, as usual, you'll respond to the research question on your forum thread, respond to at least 2 colleagues in their forum thread, as well as monitor your own thread as responses come in. As colleagues, you can support each other's learning in the forum by posting your initial response in a timely way. That'll give your colleagues ample time to respond on your thread and you to respond on theirs. And each of you in your group needs to be sure that each of your colleagues has an opportunity to learn from your comments on their thread. So have a look and see if anyone has so far not had any responses, and maybe you can contribute to that person's learning on their thread. For more details about Part 1 of the Annotated Bibliography and Synthesis assignment, and I should note that in Part 1, you'll only be doing annotated bibliography. The synthesis doesn't come until the second part of the assignment. And you can read through these. They're all familiar to you and certainly are covered in detail in the video on eClass about the assignment. And I would strongly recommend that you have a look at that. Just want to note again, maximum of 5 to 7 pages for the whole assignment, not including your title page, and you are expected to have a title page. Your paper should be double-spaced. You should use a font that's easy to read, like Times New Roman, Calibri, and so on. 12-point font, 1-inch margins, and your cover page is not included in the page count. Please do not submit as a PDF or a Google Doc, anything really other than a Word document. And I know there's a couple of you for whom that's difficult. If there's any way around that, I would really appreciate it, because it really makes marking a much more fulsome kind of experience, rather than just some marks on a page and some comments. You'll actually have comments within your manuscript if I'm able to respond right in the manuscript. Okay. From a we're going to be looking at 2 perspectives around ontology, epistemology, and methodology in this module. And the Western perspective is represented by Egan Guba and Ivana Lincoln, who are among the first and certainly the most well-known to challenge the dominance of positivism in education research. Up until that time, we'll talk about that later, positivism had been dominant in all areas of research, particularly and especially in education research. Guba and Lincoln's challenge to positivism was deeply influential because it offered a strongly argued and philosophically informed response to the dominance of positivism. It had rigor, it had clout. They were married and did exceptional work in their academic lives together. Egan Guba has since died, unfortunately, but Ivana Lincoln continues her work as a scholar of research. The Western approaches to research that Guba and Lincoln explore, however, were critiqued by Indigenous scholars who did not find a place for their voice in educational research that was congruent with their experience of the world. Since the publication of Guba and Lincoln's influential paper, Indigenous scholars like Duane Donald, and Evelyn Steinhauer have worked to provide an ontology, epistemology, and methodology that speaks to and informs a deeper understanding of an Indigenous worldview. Both Duane Donald and Evelyn Steinhauer are Indigenous scholars at the University of Alberta, and they're really remarkable. They were remarkable colleagues. Although each approached their research differently, both bring an Indigenous worldview to their work and talk about what that looks like and means to them in the papers that you'll be reading. Okay, let's begin by exploring 3 key concepts in Guba and Lincoln, as well as the Nurse Killam video, which is the other required watching, I guess it would be, that you'll be doing in this module. The first is ontology, which considers the nature of being, what things are, or the thing itself. Now, what do we mean by the thing itself, or the nature of being? Well, ontology is interested in what is the essence of the thing under examination, or what is the nature of reality. For example, we might consider an object such as a table. We can touch it, feel it, enumerate its properties, and we can be confident that those properties will not change when we walk out of the room, for example. It stays as it is. Tables may come in many forms: thick, ornate legs, metal legs, thin legs, wide legs, or whatever. Wide and narrow tops, round tops, rectangular tops, whatever, all kinds of shapes of tops. Made of, it might be made of wood or plastic or stone, but we know a table when we see it and can identify one because of its essential nature, its essence, its tableness, if you want to say it that way, which in this case is physical and visual. However, the ontology of concepts such as thinking, learning, memory, discipline, play, reading, or learning to read, all of these sorts of things, which are a part of the social sciences like education, are more problematic. How do we come to an understanding of the thing itself when it's not available to us for physical examination? What is the essence or nature of something that is more nebulous in nature? And ontology is the study of such questions. Epistemology is kind of a sister philosophy. Epistemology is the study of the nature of knowledge and helps us to justify our belief. That is, it's the study of how we know what we think we know about physical and social phenomena. It's the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief in X, Y, or Z from opinion about X, Y, or Z. In academic work from a Western perspective, there is an emphasis on justifying a knowledge claim that we make through citing recognized experts in that field of study, and or providing information about the validity or trustworthiness of that knowledge claim through our own research that has been reviewed by peers, etc. In our daily lives, personal experience is an important source of data, but may be problematic in academia if it cannot be verified through acceptable proofs. That is, information that provides acceptable confirmation that we know what we think we know. And in a day in which truthiness, to use Stephen Colbert's famous term, and alternative facts, which is something that came up during the Trump era, seem at times, as those words seem at times, or those concepts of truth seem at times to be driving policymaking and public and political action. We can see it, for example, today in all of the reactions around COVID and so on. We can see the importance of epistemological rigor. However, we can also see that other life worlds and forms of knowledge may not find legitimacy within certain epistemological norms, and this is the issue that particularly Steinhauer addresses in her paper. Last is methodology, which is the systematic, theoretical analysis of the methods applied to a field of study. For those of us doing research, there is a necessity to go through the process of choosing a theoretical approach to your research. Is it going to be quantitative? Is it going to be qualitative? And within qualitative, which one is it going to be? And there are many choices, and Guba and Lincoln go into that, and we'll talk about that. And then thinking through and presenting that theoretical approach and your rationale for its choice in light of your research question, And then those methods are reflected in the methodology that you choose and used to rigorously explore your research question. We'll continue to talk about this throughout the course, but Guba and Lincoln provide an essential grounding for that investigation. One of the key terms that Guba and Lincoln consider is the notion of paradigm. That is, an umbrella or overarching concept that encompasses ontology, epistemology, and methodology. I understand a paradigm to be a distinct set of concepts and thought patterns that guide the choices we make and what is accepted as credible. So it's kind of within a discursive context as well, and in the sense that there's a group of people that have agreed upon how they feel about an overarching ontology, epistemology, and methodology. In the context of research, a paradigm is related to the researcher's basic belief or worldview, even quantitative. So there really is no objective research because we're always saturated in our belief system and worldview. It's how we handle that becomes the issue. And we see that in the contrasting views of Guba and Lincoln, as well as Steinhauer and Donald. Their basic belief system and worldview guide the choices made by them because of their fundamental beliefs and values about research, about knowledge, and about the phenomenon under investigation, and the ontology and epistemology from which those choices spring. A paradigm, then, encompasses the theories and research methods, as well as the postulates or claims made by the researcher and the standards by which the validity of that research is judged. In research, the dominant paradigm then includes the convictions and beliefs of the discipline for what constitutes acceptable research. And we see an example of this when, for example, a researcher steps outside of that paradigmatic belief system, or ontological, epistemological, and methodological preference, and tries to publish a paper in a journal that is informed by that particular paradigm. Oftentimes they can't, for a very long time until that paradigm begins to shift, they can't publish in those journals. And I'll be giving you an example of that in a minute. Thomas Kuhn wrote about this phenomenon in 1962, which is telling because, of course, this was a time of social unrest and great questioning of the social, political, and economic status quo. You've probably heard stories about the 60s and what went on, and the ways in which, much of what was going on in the world was being questioned during that time. And it was in science as well. So he was writing from within the context of what we might call the hard sciences, where many of the conventions were being questioned during the 60s. As he observed this phenomenon in science, he appropriated an old term, paradigm, meaning an example, model, or pattern, and devised the term paradigm shift or pattern shift. That is, the accepted norm, model, pattern had shifted or changed. Of course, the word paradigm and paradigm shift have been taken up by popular culture and the meaning has been somewhat obscured. But Kuhn's concept has been very important in understanding how shifts occur over time in the study and understanding of natural and social phenomena. For example, the Greenfield-Griffiths debate in 1974 demonstrates the ways in which a paradigm shift occurs in education research and its importance in shifting the research possibilities and enhanced understandings in the study of, in this case, educational administration and leadership. Tom Greenfield was a scholar, a Canadian scholar, and Griffiths was an American scholar, both of them highly regarded, both of them deeply invested in positivism, and their research reflected that, just as the field reflected that. That was the paradigm, the preferred paradigm in educational administration. And they were pleasant colleagues. They, presented at conferences together, questioned one another's work, reviewed one another's work, all that sort of thing. And then Tom Greenfield began to be interested in some of the European philosophies and European philosophers, and he was going on sabbatical. So he decided to go to Europe and study with those philosophers or those who were experts in that area. And he was particularly interested in interpretivism. He wanted to start asking questions that had a more existential kind of bent to them. So, for example, how might we understand the role of a principal? How might the role of power in organizations be understood? And he learned about this, and he began thinking about his research very differently. And he wanted to present these ideas to his colleagues. He did not go to Bristol, England that year to start a revolution, but that's sort of how it was taken. So in 1974, he presented at an international conference in Bristol, England, attended by Griffiths, whose work was still firmly entrenched in the positivist camp. Griffiths did not respond well to what he perceived as an unwelcome paradigm shift by Greenfield. And from all reports that I've heard from people who were there or heard about it, the response was not only lively, it was loud. And the room was packed, apparently, where the presentation was made. And there was just, shouting, and it was very unacademic in a lot of ways. But it was, it was the start of what was a bit of a revolution. But Greenfield, in many ways, paid the price for that because he was largely shunned for quite a while, for a very long time, actually. And right up until the time when I was doing my doctoral work in the 2000s, early 2000s, there were still papers being presented about the Greenfield-Griffiths debate, about the philosophical underpinnings of that debate. So it really, that paradigm shift was really not accepted until the early 2000s. And even then, there are still some that are holdouts. So Greenfield was shunned for how he was thinking about the research that he was doing, his epistemological, ontological, and methodological perspective. And his publications are few as a result. They are there, but they're few, and they're well worth reading. I remember when the first time I read Greenfield, I reported to my professor that night that I had kind of fallen in love because all of a sudden I was reading something that had real depth and meaning for me, and many others felt the same way. But unfortunately, there weren't a lot of them that we got to enjoy. But he was accepted in the UK and Australia first, and it took a long time before he was accepted in the United States. He was accepted in Canada eventually, and his work began to find an audience, and his students' work began to find an audience as well, and they were publishing interpretivist work as well. So we see an example of how a paradigm shift doesn't happen in a linear or continuous way. It happens unevenly and kind of in chunks, sort of, over time. His work opened up opportunities to shift the focus from generalizable explanations supported by statistical evidence to more existential questions that help teachers and school leaders understand the social context in which they were engaged, and in doing so enabled more informed action that was particular to the context. Over time, the paradigm his work represented became more acceptable and is commonly used now in admin, leadership, and scholarship, but that took a good long time. What the Greenfield and Griffiths debate represents is a paradigmatic shift in which the predominant methodological approach was positivist, scientific, and quantitative. There had been paradigmatic rumblings in curriculum studies in education for quite a while, and they were far more open to qualitative approaches to research much sooner than in admin and leadership, and also in educational psychology. And both of those fields hung tough for a long time, and in fact, educational psychology still uses mostly positivist research. But when the paradigm shift began to occur with the work of Tom Greenfield, as we've mentioned, and a growing number of critical theorists in the field of ed admin, along with curriculum theorists, the field started to open up, or the research field started to open up. Guba and Lincoln then considered the paradigm shift from quantitative to qualitative research happening in educational research. While the quantitative paradigm was still dominant when they wrote this paper, and it had been for some time, their work was considered revolutionary. While there had been researchers in education doing qualitative work, there hadn't been a rigorous philosophical examination of this shift and its worth until they're pushing forward the paradigmatic shift to qualitative work. but not without vigorous debate and outright resistance, all characteristic, according to Kuhn, of paradigm shifts. And in my own work, I felt that too, because I was doing my research and wanted to use qualitative approaches right at that juncture around in my master's around 1995. And so, I felt it, and I can tell you stories about that, but I won't. We're getting past time. Okay, I'll move along quickly from here and consider the outline or skeleton of the arguments that Guba and Lincoln present in this article, beginning with their critiques of quantitative research in education. As already mentioned, quantitative research was, and still is to a far lesser degree, the dominant form of inquiry in the physical as well as some of the social sciences, including education, particularly in influential fields of study like educational psychology. However, as a new paradigm began to emerge, not surprisingly, critiques emerged as well. And I've got this little, the famous blind man and the elephant, as a representative of how research had been approached, that is, in kind of bits and pieces to be put together. The internal critiques looked at, for example, context stripping in quantitative research and argued that context is central to many of the most important questions in education and that it had to be a part of any theoretical position taken by research. Otherwise, meaning and purpose were stripped away as well. So if you think back to the quote from Hostetler that I included in the teaching video in Module 2, his statement reinforces this critique when he argues that good research is research that works to improve the human condition, and those conditions are context-specific. Further, the conclusions of quantitative research were meant to be generally applicable, whereas many education issues are context-specific, and further, that discovery in qualitative research, rather than prediction, that is, the hypothesis of quantitative research, was essential in studying unpredictable environments and people in a social institution like education, where it might be difficult to hypothesize up front, but rather to they're arguing here to use a discovery method to explore. External critiques followed on the internal critiques. Guba and Lincoln argue that these critiques were the tipping point. Facts seen as value-free, which is core to quantitative research, was questioned by qualitative researchers who argued that facts are socially constructed and contextually determined. That is, while it may be entirely predictable that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius in the physical sciences, the point at which social phenomena occur is a different kind of fact in the social sciences. For example, we know that social environment has a great deal to do with educational success, but it is impossible to predict the degree to which that fact will become reality. And I put fact in quotation marks. If at all, in all cases. So facts, again in quotation marks, within a qualitative paradigm must be examined very differently and cannot be predicted and then verified nor generalized as they are in quantitative analysis. Both sets of critiques were influential, but the second set proved to be the tipping point for paradigmatic change. Guba and Lincoln argue that there are four major paradigmatic approaches to research. Now, Marshall et al., they kind of push this forward a little bit because they're writing much later. But these are the four categories that have stood the test of time for a very long time, and they're worth having a serious look at. Positivism, that is, inquiry that relies on observation and quantifiable analysis to determine reality. Post-positivism, which comes out of positivism and recognizes that truth is fallible and cannot be verified in any final sense, so the social sciences opens up greater opportunities for a limited contextual analysis, but still stays within scientific traditions. Then in the qualitative realm, we have critical theory, which has as its goal emancipation from social norms that limit fair opportunities for all. And they go into a significant amount of detail about that. And Marshall et al. Take that up in significant detail as well. And constructivism or naturalism comes out of interpretivist philosophical traditions that may be emancipatory but are focused primarily on understanding what is. And in that sense are perhaps more ontological in nature. Again, check out the videos for more information. And you'll be doing that in your final assignment, so you don't need to do that right now. But there are a whole bunch of videos from these different perspectives that you'll be able to have a look at. And then, of course, in between all of these, and this is something that Creswell and Guterman propose, is a mixture of the two that they call, you might not be surprised, mixed methods, where they mix these methods in various ways. And, you know, there's a whole tradition around that as well. Now, I don't even have postmodernism and post-structuralism or post-colonialism on this slide. They could arguably be seen as related to critical theory, probably most closely, if they're emancipatory, but may arguably be seen as outside conventional theory. And so they really, in a sense, don't belong in this discussion, but they are highly important. And again, Marshall and I'll take that up in much more detail. Since Guba and Lincoln developed this typology of paradigmatic streams, others have challenged them, including Indigenous scholars who do not want to fit neatly into what Donald terms colonial logics. In some ways, critical theory and forms of constructivism, such as phenomenology, come closest, but do not directly address cultural particularities. However, as a way of combating the determinism of colonial logics in our research and pedagogical practices, their work is very instructive in providing a glimpse into their important rethinking of dominant research norms. The rest of the paper goes on to expand, that is Guba and Lincoln's paper, goes on to expand on the ideas discussed and includes this list of topics. Now, I'm not going to go into them in detail. They certainly do that. But they after they've explored those four paradigms, then they look at them cross-paradigm analysis, intra-paradigm analysis, and so on, and some important questions that many of you ask, and so they're worth having a look at. Guba and Lincoln's paper is very challenging to read, but it introduces many key concepts in establishing the theoretical and paradigmatic grounding in research, and is an excellent resource to return to in your work. And last, and this is the last slide, this quote from Ojibwe elder and anthropologist Basil Johnson in many ways gets to the heart of both Steinhauer's and Dwayne Donald's more recent paper on metasage, and Evelyn Steinhauer's exploration of various Indigenous scholars' look at research, in which they both explore ontology, epistemology, methodology from an Indigenous perspective. In both cases, they reference stories and the importance of ceremony, ritual, song, dance, and prayer as core to their approach to research that is informed by and explores Indigenous ontology, epistemology, and they point to culturally appropriate methodologies. In both papers, they argue against the atomization or breaking apart of human experience and argue instead for a holistic approach as an ethical necessity. This is what Basil Johnson says. If the Native peoples and their heritage are to be understood, it is their beliefs, insights, concepts, ideals, values, attitudes, and codes that must be studied. And there is, I submit, no better way of gaining that understanding than by examining Native ceremonies, rituals, songs, dances, prayers, and stories. For it is in ceremony, ritual, song, dance, and prayer that the sum total of what people believe about life, being, existence, and relationships are symbolically expressed and articulated, as it is in story, fable, legend, and myth, that fundamental understandings, insights, and attitudes toward life and human conduct, character, and quality in their diverse forms are embodied and passed on. And this is, I think, a kind of summarizes in many ways, in important ways, what Donald and Steinhauer offer. Because they offer a methodology that provides not only a way to better come to an understanding of Indigenous contexts, stories, and experiences, but also a way to do so that moves away from a colonial logic by a form of researching that Donald calls metasage, which offers through story, located in shared place, a new way of living with one another across difference. Steinhauer provides a wide lens and explores Indigenous scholars' views on Indigenous research. In both, we catch a glimpse of the ontological, epistemological, and methodological possibilities of Indigenous-led research that leads to good research, research that enlightens, enriches, and builds bridges among and between communities of difference. They also explore the positionality of Indigenous scholars as essential to the work of researching in Indigenous contexts. I'll conclude here and thank you for your patience in watching this longer than usual video. As always, if you have any questions about anything in this module, please let me know.